The moment you completely remove yourself from her life is often the moment she begins thinking about you the most. Most men never see this coming. They assume that walking away means surrendering. They stop reaching out, stop checking in, stop making themselves available, and then spend the following weeks questioning their decision. While they're staring at their phone wondering if they made a mistake, they imagine she's already moved on without a second thought. But that is rarely how the psychology of absence works. Because when you leave without drama, without emotional speeches, without trying to force understanding, something unexpected happens. You remove the comfort that protected her from feeling your absence. No reassuring texts, no emotional support, no familiar presence waiting in the background, no version of you cushioning the consequences of losing access. And once that cushion disappears, her mind is left alone with something it cannot immediately solve. The reality that you are no longer there. That is where everything begins. In this video, we're going to break down why silence after a breakup often creates delayed regret, why disappearing calmly changes the emotional dynamic completely, and why staying unavailable accomplishes more than any emotional message ever could. If you've ever wondered why walking away feels painful for you at first, but seems to affect her much later, stay with me, because the first shift happens long before regret ever appears. It begins the moment she loses access. Most men think attraction is about attention. It isn't. Attention comes and goes. Access is what truly matters. The second someone assumes they can reach you whenever they want, your presence starts feeling ordinary, and ordinary things rarely create emotional impact. Think about a man named Mark, 52 years old, recently separated from a woman he cared deeply about. As the relationship faded, he kept doing what many men do. He stayed available. He sent the occasional message, checked in, remained friendly, tried to show maturity. In his mind, he was handling things the right way. But there was one problem. Because he remained available, she never experienced what losing him actually felt like. He was still present, still reachable, still part of her emotional environment. Now compare that with Brian, 48. After realizing the relationship had reached its end, he chose a different path. No dramatic goodbye, no endless conversation, no attempts to convince her of anything. He simply stepped away and stopped creating new contact. At first, nothing seemed different. She appeared fine, maybe even relieved. But then the routines started disappearing. The familiar messages stopped. The reactions stopped. The daily access she had unconsciously grown used to was suddenly gone. And that's when the mind begins noticing something important: the gap. This is the part most people misunderstand. Human beings rarely process loss in a single moment. They process absence over time. The nervous system notices patterns before it notices emotions. When a familiar pattern disappears, awareness grows. Awareness creates comparison. Comparison creates emotional weight. An emotional weight often becomes regret, but only if the absence is real. If you continue offering emotional support, continue responding to every breadcrumb, continue making yourself available after the relationship ends, you're not creating absence. You're creating a softer version of the relationship. You're helping her adapt. And every time you help her adapt, you reduce the impact of losing you, because people don't miss what they can still access. And access isn't only physical, it's emotional, it's psychological. If she can still call you when she's lonely, still receive validation when she needs reassurance, still feel your attention whenever she wants it, she hasn't truly lost you. She has simply adjusted your position in her life. That adjustment creates comfort, and comfort rarely creates longing. What creates longing is contrast. The contrast between having something and suddenly not having it. The contrast between certainty and silence. The contrast between knowing you're there and realizing you're not. Once that contrast appears, the mind starts replaying. Not every memory, usually the meaningful ones. The moments that felt safe. The conversations that felt genuine. The emotional connection that once seemed guaranteed. And that replay becomes stronger when there is no new information replacing it. Unfortunately, this is where many men sabotage themselves. A late-night message arrives. A breadcrumb appears. A casual check-in. And suddenly they reopen the door. Not because they are weak, because they hope. But hope often restores the very comfort that regret needs removed. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply creates space and refuses to fill it unnecessarily, because once you become unavailable, something fascinating happens. You stop being a certainty, you become a question, and questions stay in the mind far longer than answers ever do. If that resonates with you, write this in the comments. I removed access. Because what happens next goes even deeper. The moment access disappears, silence takes over, and silence affects the human mind in ways most people never fully understand. People assume silence means nothing is happening. The truth is exactly the opposite. Silence is where the real psychological work begins. The moment communication stops, certainty disappears with it. No explanations, no updates, no emotional roadmap, nothing. And the brain struggles with that, because the mind craves resolution. It wants complete stories, clear endings, defined answers. When those answers don't arrive, the mind starts creating its own. It replays conversations, examines details, searches for meaning, looks for clues that may not even exist. That process creates tension, and tension keeps emotional investment alive. This is why silence often hits harder than an argument. An argument still provides structure. It gives her something to interpret, something to categorize, something to understand. Silence removes all of that, and when certainty disappears, the imagination takes over, which leads directly to the next mistake most men make after a breakup, the mistake that destroys regret before it even has a chance to form. They start explaining, and that's exactly where most men make the mistake. They start talking, they start clarifying, they start trying to make sure she understands what happened. What they don't realize is that every explanation carries a hidden message. It says, I still need you to understand me. And the moment your emotional completion depends on her understanding, you've handed her something valuable, your frame. Women don't want to become responsible for regulating your emotions after the relationship ends. They don't want to feel like they must carry the weight of your closure. What creates emotional impact isn't making her understand. It's allowing her to experience the reality of losing access to you. There's another trap many men fall into. They become obsessed with being seen as right. They defend themselves, correct every misunderstanding, respond to every accusation, try to prove they were the good man in the story. But attraction has never been built on courtroom arguments. It's built on presence. And presence disappears the moment you begin pleading your case. Think about Mike, 54 years old. After his breakup, every message received a response, every question got an answer, every misunderstanding was corrected. He believed he was showing maturity, but what he was really doing was maintaining the connection. The cord never snapped, the emotional separation never fully happened. Now look at Paul, 49. When the relationship ended, he answered respectfully once, briefly, clearly. Then he stepped away. No hostility, no emotional performance, no lingering conversation. Weeks later, the silence carried far more weight than any explanation could have, because nothing remained to soften the reality of his absence. That distinction matters. This isn't about punishment. It's about allowing reality to arrive without interference. Words absorb impact. Silence allows impact to land. And there's something else most men never notice. The more you explain yourself, the more fixed you become in her mind. She remembers exactly where she left you. Exactly how emotional you were, exactly how available you remained. But when you stop explaining, something unusual happens. You become undefined, and undefined things grow. The imagination expands what it cannot fully measure. The version of you she remembers is no longer updated by reality. Instead, it evolves inside her mind. Stronger, calmer, more difficult to replace. That is why some absences become larger with time instead of smaller. If that resonates, write this in the comments. I owe no explanations. Because what comes next is where the emotional shift becomes impossible to ignore. Most men think their value is felt while they're present. The opposite is often true. Your value is often felt most intensely after you're gone. Think about it. When someone becomes part of everyday life, the nervous system adapts. The messages become normal. The attention becomes expected. The availability becomes assumed. Familiarity slowly hides value. Then suddenly it's gone. And the nervous system notices immediately. Not because it misses every detail, because it notices the contrast. Contrast creates awareness. Awareness creates feeling, and feeling creates attachment. That is why absence can become louder than presence. When you're still available, still talking, still helping her process the separation, you're actively reducing the impact of losing you. You're helping her transition, you're making the adjustment easier. But when you step away completely, something different happens. The mind starts encountering empty spaces, a familiar time of day, a routine conversation that no longer happens, a moment when your name would normally appear on her screen. Those small gaps become emotional reminders, and reminders are powerful because they arrive unexpectedly, not through logic, through experience. This is why silence often appears weak to men who fear losing control. In reality, restraint creates weight, and weight is what people feel. The moment you're no longer guiding the emotional process, her attention turns inward. Questions begin appearing, not necessarily aloud, privately, quietly, unexpectedly. Did I underestimate him? Why does this feel heavier now? Why am I thinking about him when I thought I was fine? Those questions don't come from conversation, they come from the lack of conversation. And that is why absence creates something words rarely can: internal dialogue, the kind that continues long after the conversation ends. The problem is that most men interrupt this process. A text arrives, curiosity appears, loneliness shows up, and suddenly they reopen the door. The pressure disappears, the emotional weight fades, the process resets. That's why patience matters. Not because you're waiting for her, because you're allowing reality to do what your explanations never could. And this leads directly into the next stage, the stage that confuses almost every man after a breakup. Because the first thing she often feels isn't sadness, it's relief. And if you misunderstand that relief, you'll ruin everything before the deeper emotions ever have a chance to emerge. Many men panic when they see it. They assume relief means certainty. They assume relief means she never cared. They assume relief means the story is over. But relief is often just the nervous system relaxing after tension. It's temporary. It's the exhale, not the conclusion. Imagine Steve, 51. After ending things, he disappeared quietly. No emotional chasing, no attempts to reconnect. For the first week, Laura felt lighter. The pressure was gone. The conversations were gone. The emotional friction disappeared. She convinced herself it was the right decision. But then something changed. The quiet remained. The routine didn't return. The familiar presence stayed absent. And what initially felt like freedom slowly became something harder to define. The evenings felt different. The days felt less grounded. The emotional stability she once took for granted became visible only after it disappeared. That's the part many people never expect. The mind often notices value after adjustment begins, not before. And that delayed recognition is where regret quietly starts forming, which brings us to the shift that changes the entire dynamic. Because while she's trying to understand what changed, something else is happening. Without realizing it, you're taking back control. And that's the moment everything begins to change. Because real control doesn't come from changing someone else's mind. It comes from finally stepping out of the emotional storm and refusing to be dragged back into it. Most men stay connected far longer than they should because they're trying to repair a feeling. They want understanding. They want closure. They want things to make sense. But every attempt to fix the emotional tension keeps them tied to it. The moment you stop trying to manage what another person feels, something unexpected happens. Your attention comes back home. The energy that was spent analyzing texts, replaying conversations, and imagining different outcomes starts moving in a different direction, toward your own life. Marcus Aurelius understood this long before modern psychology ever gave it a name. He reminded himself that our power exists only over our own mind, never over external events. And when that truth finally lands, the chase ends. You stop fighting reality. You stop arguing with what already happened. You stop treating uncertainty like a problem that needs solving. Instead, your focus shifts toward the things that have always belonged to you: your habits, your discipline, your decisions, your future. Something else happens too. Your nervous system begins to settle. No more checking your phone every few minutes. No more interpreting silence as a message. No more emotional highs followed by emotional crashes. The body relaxes. The mind clears. Presence returns. And that quiet presence carries a kind of strength that people notice even when you're not saying a word. You stop negotiating for understanding. You stop over-explaining your intentions. You stop defending your value. Your absence begins speaking louder than your explanations ever could. For many men, this feels uncomfortable at first because it resembles letting go. But it isn't surrender, it's ownership. Ownership of your time, ownership of your focus, ownership of your dignity. The Stoics called this temperance, the ability to govern yourself instead of being governed by impulse. Every time you resist the urge to reach out, you reinforce the strongest version of your identity. Gradually, something deeper shifts. You no longer see yourself as the man waiting to be chosen. You become the man choosing his direction. And once that transformation begins, your sense of worth is no longer attached to outcomes. You stop needing a particular response to feel complete. You stop needing validation to feel valuable. You simply move forward. That change alters the way you see the past as well. The memories remain, but the emotional charge begins to fade. Instead of obsessing over what went wrong, you extract wisdom. Instead of romanticizing the pain, you understand it. Instead of assigning meaning to every silence, you accept what is. And when acceptance replaces resistance, confidence emerges naturally. Not performative confidence, not forced confidence. The kind that arrives quietly because there is no longer a war happening inside you. If this resonates, leave a comment below. I choose control. Because what comes next is where most people completely misunderstand attraction. They think attraction is created through effort, through persuasion, through constant communication. But some of the strongest attraction emerges when effort disappears. This is where calm detachment enters the picture. And calm detachment is often mistaken for coldness. It isn't. Coldness creates distance. Calm detachment creates freedom. There's no resentment in it, no hidden agenda, no attempt to make someone miss you, no secret strategy. You simply become deeply rooted in yourself. And paradoxically, that is what makes your presence more powerful. Most people only detach after becoming hurt or angry. That version feels defensive, heavy, predictable. But calm detachment comes from acceptance. You aren't withdrawing to punish. You aren't disappearing to prove a point. You're simply no longer trying to control the outcome. Psychologically, this changes everything, because emotional pressure vanishes. And when pressure disappears, people finally have room to feel what they genuinely feel. Think about it. When someone senses that you're no longer trying to influence their emotions, their defenses begin to lower. The tension fades, the dynamic changes, and that's where something unexpected starts to happen. Not because you're chasing attraction, but because you've stopped chasing altogether. A woman can feel the difference between attachment and self-possession. One seeks reassurance, the other radiates certainty, and certainty has a gravity of its own. Imagine running into someone months later. No bitterness, no emotional speeches, no subtle attempts to reopen old chapters, just genuine calm. You smile, you listen, you remain fully present, and then you leave without needing anything. That interaction often creates more impact than months of trying ever could, because now the energy feels different, and that difference is difficult to ignore, especially when she begins comparing who you are now to the version she remembers. That's when another psychological process quietly begins unfolding beneath the surface. A process that almost nobody notices while it's happening, because regret rarely arrives when people expect it to. In fact, its timing is precisely what makes it so powerful. And that's exactly why the next mistake is so costly, because after weeks of discipline, silence, and rebuilding yourself, many men suddenly convince themselves that one small step backward won't matter. But it does. The urge to return usually arrives disguised as something reasonable: closure, compassion, a second chance. Yet more often than not, it's simply discomfort looking for relief. The problem is that relief and growth rarely travel in the same direction. When you go back before anything has truly changed, you erase the contrast that silence worked so hard to create. Think about it. The moment access becomes easy again, the emotional weight of your absence disappears. Questions disappear. Reflection slows. The mind stops exploring what was lost because it no longer feels lost. This is why consistency matters. Not because you're trying to punish someone, not because you're playing a game, but because your actions must finally match your standards. A man who repeatedly abandons his own boundaries teaches others that those boundaries were never real, and people rarely value what remains available regardless of how they behave. Many men mistake curiosity for commitment. A message is not transformation. Missing you is not the same as choosing you. An emotional conversation is not proof that old patterns won't return. Real change is visible. It reveals itself through actions repeated over time. Strong men learn to trust behavior more than emotion. Because emotions fluctuate, behavior tells the truth. The deeper lesson isn't about whether she comes back. It's about whether you abandon yourself when she does. That's the real test. Not the breakup, not the silence, not the loneliness. The test is whether you remain aligned when the door opens again, because self-respect becomes fragile when it's dependent on validation. The moment your worth rises and falls with someone else's attention, you've handed away the very power you fought to reclaim. And that brings us to the final truth. Walking away was never about creating distance. It was about creating clarity. For most men, walking away feels like losing. It feels like surrendering something valuable. But often, what you're actually surrendering is confusion, the endless analyzing, the waiting, the hope attached to outcomes you cannot control. When that burden leaves your shoulders, something remarkable happens. You begin moving again. Your energy returns. Your attention returns. Your life starts expanding beyond the narrow space one person occupied inside your mind. And that's where attraction becomes misunderstood. People often assume desire comes from staying visible, from remaining present, from constantly reminding someone of your value. Yet the strongest impression is often left by the person who quietly continues forward, not angrily. Not dramatically, simply forward, because certainty is comfortable, but mystery lingers. And when someone realizes you are genuinely moving on, not pretending, not performing, not waiting, they encounter something they cannot influence anymore. That realization carries weight, not because you've become unavailable, but because you've become self-directed. There's a difference. One seeks control, the other reflects freedom. Women notice that freedom, not through words, through energy, through posture, through the absence of emotional chasing, through the calm confidence of a man whose identity is no longer attached to being chosen. And perhaps that's the most important lesson in everything we've discussed. The goal was never to make her regret losing you. The goal was to stop losing yourself, because when a man reconnects with his purpose, his discipline, and his self-respect, something changes permanently. He stops measuring his value through reactions. He stops negotiating for attention. He stops explaining why he deserves appreciation. Instead, he becomes the kind of man whose presence speaks before he does. Whether she returns becomes secondary. Whether she understands becomes secondary. Whether the story ever continues becomes secondary. Because the greatest victory was never getting her back. The greatest victory was getting yourself back. That is why walking away carries so much power. Not because it controls another person, but because it restores ownership over your own life. And once you experience that kind of freedom, you begin to realize something that wasn't obvious in the beginning. The silence was never the transformation. You were. If this message resonated with you, consider subscribing to Modern Stoic Mind and joining us for future conversations on self-respect, emotional discipline, and masculine growth. Until next time, remember this: the people who leave the deepest mark are rarely the ones who begged to stay. They're the ones who walked forward with dignity, became stronger in the process, and never needed the world to validate who they were. And somewhere down the road, when you look back at the moment that once felt impossible to survive, you may discover that losing what you thought you needed was actually the beginning of becoming the man you were meant to be.